New concerns for homeowners about another possible housing crisis. A New York Times investigation found that some private equity firms which bought up distressed mortgages after the 2008 crisis are using the same aggressive tactics that banks used nearly a decade ago.
The Times reports that government sold more than 100,000 troubled mortgages. The private equity firms that bought those loans are now foreclosing on homeowners, and some are choosing not to invest in urban and low-income neighborhoods.
CBS News business analyst Jill Schlesinger is here following the developments. So explain to us what's going on. During the housing crisis, the banks backed away from these distressed mortgages, and these private equity firms sort of fill the gap.
Right. Remember that the government actually ended up insuring a whole bunch of them, and they sold these really toxic, rotten mortgages to investors, and those investors were private equity firms. So 105,000 of these loans sold in about the last 5 years or so. So here's the good part of that. Private industry comes in, fills the gap, helps steady the housing market. But those private equity firms are not subjected to the same regulatory scrutiny as banks. And as a result, they're saying like, oh, it's the same bad behavior, except the bad behavior on these firms is perfectly legitimate. They're saying, we don't have to do this. There are no rules saying we have to cut that down your principal if you're delinquent. We don't have to negotiate in earnest. We're not held to the Community Reinvestment Act and being in communities. We don't have to do that. They're right. But on the other end of it, we've got struggling homeowners who are getting pushed into foreclosing much more quickly than if a bank held that note.
So what's your advice to homeowners then? Because it's clearly having an adverse effect on the rental market.
Well, okay, so there's two parts of it. One is, okay, I'm a homeowner and I'm late. And now all of a sudden I've got this I find out later now who owned my mortgage. This private equity firm won't play with me. Well, you get to remind your private equity firm, hey, I heard about there's new rules. They're starting in September. I know you're not subjected to that, but can we at least talk? Because they're much more sensitive now to this issue because it's so widely reported. The other piece of this is that a lot of these private equity firms bought up distressed homes, not just the mortgages. They own homes. Private equity is a huge landlord right now in the United States, and there's a perverse effect of this. In many downtrodden neighborhoods, I'm talking about places in Detroit or outside in Stockton where they were really hard hit by the financial crisis, rents are rising faster than incomes. And even though it's a small piece of the market overall, what we're learning is private equity doesn't have the same incentive as, say, a mom and pop who's your landlord, like Fred and Ethel Mertz upstairs, right?
Love the Mertzes.
And when you think about a private landlord, they may say like, oh, you know what, Vlad and Anne-Marie, they're such a great couple, they're having a hard time, let me cut them some slack and keep them in the house because they're good people and I care about them. That's not happening when it's a faraway private equity firm in New York.
So do we run the risk of seeing the same thing happen that we saw with the banks? I mean, are we going to spiral out of control?
Well, remember that this is an issue, but it's a much smaller issue. And really, when we think about the core of the financial crisis, while it did center around housing, it really fomented because the banks took all these loans, they packaged them, they then put them out into the marketplace, and there was a lot of leverage, borrowed money to use against these mortgages. We're not seeing that kind of action, so I don't believe this is part of the housing crisis. But what I do think is there are always unintended consequences. And what we have now learned is that when the private sector comes in, we may need to subject the same people who are coming in and doing certain actions that maybe took the place of banks or other players in the financial system and say, wait a minute, we need to recreate rules for these folks. Last week, Housing Department actually did introduce some new rules. Again, they go into effect in September. They don't affect the 105,000 mortgages that are already out there and purchased by private equity, but the new ones that are purchased will be subject to rules where they will have to consider cutting your principal if you're having a problem, not doing something which they seem to be doing, which will drop your rate for a while, then it pops back up. More disclosure, more transparency, more consumer focus.
Keeping with your I Love Lucy theme, they have a lot of explaining to do.
Yes, indeed.
Jill Schlesinger, thank you so much.
Thanks.